Before there were diagnoses, there were just feelings. You woke up heavy, listless, unmoved by the day's demands. You couldn't explain why, exactly, but the world seemed dimmer, more distant, like someone had drawn a sheer curtain across the morning. Food tasted dull. Conversation felt like a task. The days passed, but they didn't seem to collect. And somewhere inside your ribs, it ached. Not with pain, exactly, but with the weight of something. Today, we'd call it depression. But in the mid-1800s, it was something else entirely. It might be melancholia, or nervous collapse, or female hysteria, if you had the misfortune of being born a woman. And if you were poor, or an immigrant, or simply tired in a way that made no sense to the world, you'd be told it was laziness, or madness, or spiritual decay. Doctors tried their best, sort of, but mental illness, to many in the 19th century, was slippery. It didn't leave bruises. It didn't break bones. It couldn't be stitched or cut out. There were no blood tests, no x-rays, just symptoms, strange ones. You cried too much, or didn't speak for hours, or shook when no one touched you, or stayed into your tea as if you were waiting for it to speak. And medicine did not like what it couldn't see, so they tried to make it visible. They poked and prodded and diagnosed. Some turned to electricity, wiring patients up with brass and copper. Others prescribed mercury tonics or arsenic drops or mustard plasters rubbed onto the soles of the feet. There were baths, hot, cold, alternated, diets of raw oats, hours in darkened rooms, or long walks through public parks under the watchful eyes of nurses. But the results were, at best, inconsistent. And then someone had a thought. A simple, horrifying thought. What if the depression wasn't in the mind at all? What if it was in the body, and hiding somewhere we'd never think to look? Like, behind a tooth. It started quietly. A case study here. A strange anecdote there. A patient with depression had a rotting molar pulled, and reported feeling clearer the next day. Another woman, melancholic for months, had 4 teeth removed after complaining of jaw pain. She began to laugh again by week's end. Coincidence? Maybe. But in a medical era desperate for solutions, that didn't matter. What mattered was the possibility that a root cause had been found. A literal root. It fit neatly into a growing theory of the time. That hidden infections could poison the body from the inside out. These infections, they claimed, could radiate sickness. Not just physical illness, but mental afflictions too. A foul tooth could be more than just an inconvenience. It could be the saboteur, the shadowy villain behind the scenes. So, physicians leaned in. Suddenly, dentists and doctors began working in strange tandem, not to improve smiles, but to restore minds. The practice spread, slowly at first, then wildly. You went to your doctor and told him you couldn't stop crying, and he looked at your molars. You mentioned that your child had become sullen and unmanageable, and the doctor reached for the forceps. Tooth pulling had become a treatment for sorrow, and for many, it would become a lifelong sentence. Because once a tooth was gone, there was no putting it back. It wasn't just quackery. Not exactly. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, medicine was undergoing a strange evolution. Half science, half superstition. Germ theory had gained traction. Yes, but not everyone understood it. Not fully. The idea that invisible organisms could invade your body and slowly unravel your health was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Finally, something to blame. And that blame had to land somewhere. Teeth, as it happened, made the perfect scapegoats. They were tucked away, rarely cleaned well, prone to rot and pain. A hidden battlefield just inches from the brain. Some physicians became convinced that a single decaying tooth might act like a buried landmine, silently releasing focal infections into the bloodstream, which could cause depression, anxiety, insomnia, even suicidal thoughts. And so, the war began. Doctors started to classify patients by their symptoms, but with a new obsession. Not how the person was feeling, but where the infection might be hiding. Gums were prodded, x-rays taken. A sore joint or a shadowy thought was traced backward, until the physician declared, with great satisfaction, "Ah, yes, it's your second molar." In 1900, an article published in the Journal of the American Medical Association proposed that oral infections, those pesky abscesses and gum swellings, might be responsible for everything from chronic fatigue to melancholia. Depression of the mind, they claimed, might be cured by removing the site of decay. And decay meant teeth. Soon, sanatoriums were offering tooth extractions as part of their treatment menus. Melancholic, they'd ask, we'll schedule a dental cleansing. This wasn't a gentle cleaning with mint polish and a rinse. No, it was a full-mouth assault. Some patients had all their teeth pulled in a single visit. Imagine it. You walk into a clinic, broken-hearted, unable to explain the heavy silence inside your chest. You leave hours later with gauze stuffed in your mouth, your jaw aching, and a mouth full of empty sockets. No teeth, no depression. It wasn't limited to dentists either. Physicians who had never touched a dental instrument in their lives suddenly felt qualified to yank molars. The tooth became a symbol, an enemy to be defeated. Some surgeons even recommended removing tonsils, appendix, or sinuses along with the teeth, just to be safe. Why stop at one infection site when the whole body might be a ticking time bomb? The logic was chillingly clean. Pain equals infection. Infection equals illness. Illness must be removed. Never mind that some patients didn't have dental problems. Never mind that the depression usually remained. Or that many came back weeks later, still despondent, only now missing parts of themselves. That part was brushed aside. The operation was declared a success if the patient smiled even once. One doctor described a female patient who had an uncooperative mood and a constant air of sorrow. After 4 teeth were pulled and 2 questionable molars extracted, he noted that she appeared improved. No scale, no follow-up, no patient notes, just a man with forceps and a guess. Women, as ever, were the favorite targets. Melancholia in women was considered particularly dangerous, proof that their minds were too delicate to handle modern life. If a woman showed signs of listlessness, doctors might recommend not just tooth removal, but vaginal douching, clitoral cauterization, or ovarian calming baths. But tooth extraction was quicker, easier, less scandalous, and it left no scars, at least not on the skin. There are surviving photographs, sad-eyed women with swollen cheeks, sitting in stiff chairs in convalescent homes, smiling faintly, sometimes, or not at all. Many are unnamed, their records lost, their treatments filed under resolved. And what of the teeth? They were discarded, burned, tossed in bins with other biological waste. Symbols of sorrow removed from the body, but never from the story. Because what these treatments really reflect isn't medical certainty. It's desperation, the unbearable weight of watching someone suffer and not knowing what to do. The terrifying truth that the mind cannot always be fixed, and the irresistible lure of a solution that could be held in the hand, dropped in a tray, and declared cured. Even if it never was. It's hard to blame them entirely. In 1905, a man named Dr. Frank Billings, respected, polished, and absolutely certain of himself, strode into the halls of American medicine with a theory that would linger like a bad taste in the country's mouth for decades. He called it focal sepsis. His proposal was simple, seductive, and terrifying. According to Billings, a hidden infection, a focus, could lie dormant in some dark little crevice of the body and silently poison the entire system. Not just causing fevers or rashes, but wrecking your joints, your heart, your energy, and most dangerously, your emotions. That headache, your appendix, the fatigue, your tonsils, the sorrow that clung to you like wet linen for weeks at a time. Ah yes, your teeth. Dr. Billings believed that if the focus could be removed, the whole system might heal. He urged his peers to examine the body not for what it showed, but for what it hid. And physicians, already desperate for solutions, latched onto his theory like hungry fish around a baited hook. And just like that, the medical landscape shifted. Surgeons became treasure hunters. Every inflamed gum was a goldmine of possible explanations. Every patient with a bad mood became a candidate for invasive prophylactic surgery. The cure for sadness might lie behind your molars, or in your tonsils, or even buried deep in your intestines. It was a glorious time to be a scalpel. Across America, dentists and doctors joined forces to pursue this new villain, hidden infection. X-rays were taken, swabs collected, but just as often, the evidence was based on feelings. If the patient seemed off, and if no other explanation was obvious, then out came the tools. One story, recorded in a 1922 medical journal, described a man beset by hopeless thoughts and severe melancholy. His physician recommended a full dental extraction. The man, too exhausted to argue, complied. 28 teeth were removed. The result, noticeable lightening of mood. The doctor wrote, less ruminative behavior. The man never smiled in the follow-up photo. By the 1910s, things had grown strangely theatrical. Doctors began removing body parts preemptively. Tonsils, teeth, gallbladders, all pulled with clinical enthusiasm, in the hopes of catching disease before it struck. Mental illness, they believed, could be stopped at the root, if only they could find it. One woman, aged 26, was admitted to a sanatorium after complaining of persistent morning gloom. She had no fever, no dental abscesses, no visible illness. Still, her physician decided her bicuspids looked suspicious. Out they came. She reported no change in mood. So, he scheduled the remaining molars for extraction a week later. It would be comforting to think these cases were rare, but they weren't. Between 1910 and 1930, thousands of patients with vague psychological symptoms underwent tooth extractions under the focal infection model. The movement swept through American medicine with the force of a revival. Hospitals competed to see how many successful extractions they could tally. Medical journals shared glowing case studies of patients who, after losing their teeth, seemed less sullen or more willing to engage. It all sounded very tidy, very clean, and very wrong. The results, unsurprisingly, were mixed. Some patients did feel better, temporarily, perhaps because they'd undergone a dramatic intervention, perhaps because someone had finally done something. Others remained depressed, anxious, or even worse off, now burdened with the added pain and stigma of having lost parts of their body for nothing. In 1927, a scathing article appeared in The Lancet, warning of the reckless over-application of focal infection theory. European doctors were growing skeptical, but in the U.S., the practice persisted. Why? Because it was easy. It gave doctors control over something uncontrollable. It let families feel hopeful again. And it gave patients, especially those suffering silently, a sense that they were finally being heard, even if their cries were met with forceps. By the late 1930s, more researchers began pushing back. They studied large groups of depressed patients and found no consistent correlation between oral infections and mental illness. The results were underwhelming. Some even said that the tooth-pulling craze had been more faith than fact. But by then, the damage was done. A generation of patients had passed through hospitals and clinics, handing over their teeth in the name of mental clarity. They went home to soft diets, sunken cheeks, and the same invisible sadness they'd arrived with. No better, just quieter. And yet, focal infection theory never truly vanished. It simply retreated into the background, waiting for its next rebrand. Some modern alternative practitioners still whisper its claims. Detox your body, remove toxic metals, clear your energy pathways. The language has changed, but the ache remains the same. Because what haunts us is not just the past treatments, it's the future ones too. The ones that, decades from now, might look just as misguided, just as earnest, just as painful. As focal infection theory spread its roots through American hospitals, another body part quietly entered the spotlight, the humble tonsil. Nestled in the back of the throat, these little lymphatic sentinels had long been treated as bothersome but benign. But to the fevered minds of early 20th century doctors, the tonsils were now seen as ticking time bombs, hotbeds of silent infection that might secretly be orchestrating everything from arthritis to anxiety to existential dread. Soon, tonsillectomies became one of the most frequently performed surgeries in the country, not just for children, but for adults who hadn't smiled in weeks or who found themselves brooding over the changing light in autumn. Anxious. Out go the tonsils. Unable to get out of bed before noon. Say goodbye to your adenoids. By 1925, some physicians were advocating for preventive tonsillectomies for anyone with persistent low moods. The operation was quick, bloody, and widely available. And, crucially, it gave doctors something visible to do in the face of invisible suffering. One Chicago clinic proudly reported that of 117 patients with melancholic tendencies, 82 had their tonsils removed within 2 weeks of admission. Another facility in Pennsylvania maintained an entire ward for glandular purification, code for throat-based surgery on moody housewives and disobedient schoolboys alike. The goal was rarely cure. It was containment. Mental health still carried immense stigma. Admitting that someone was nervous or unstable could invite shame, institutionalization, or worse. But a swollen tonsil, that was neutral. That was respectable. You could tell your neighbors you were under the weather. Never mind that your doctor had ordered your throat scraped in the name of emotional balance. Of course, not all surgeries were performed with clean intentions. By the 1910s and 20s, a growing network of sanitariums, private institutions that promised rest, fresh air, and medical wisdom, had begun advertising their ability to treat nervous conditions with minor surgeries. These weren't the grim asylums of the Victorian age, but well-appointed retreats for the middle and upper classes, the kind of places where melancholy women in tea-colored gowns were encouraged to rest under lilac trees while a polite nurse scheduled their next extraction. Patients checked in for fatigue of the spirit. They came out missing teeth, tonsils, and sometimes gallbladders. One such place, the Belhaven Retreat in upstate New York, advertised in magazines, where the burdened soul finds peace, and the hidden infection meets its end. It sounds absurd now, but back then, the logic went something like this. If your emotions are diseased, and if your body houses the disease, then the solution must be to cleanse the body, no matter how many organs that requires. Surgeons became part-time psychiatrists. Nurses were trained to watch for signs of post-surgical gloom, and to report if patients didn't seem sufficiently grateful for the procedure. Some even blamed lingering depression on the reluctance of the patient to believe in their own cure. To question the surgery was to question science itself. One doctor, writing in a 1930 Medical Digest, described a patient who persisted in her sadness even after a successful tonsillectomy. He concluded that she had psychological resistance to healing, and that the failure was no fault of the intervention. This wasn't just medicine, it was faith, and for some, it truly did bring comfort. After all, when the world offered no explanations for your sadness, when life kept turning gray and dull for no reason at all, it must have been tempting to believe that a tiny organ in your throat was to blame. At least that could be removed. In this way, surgery became a kind of spiritual ritual, a sacrifice, a cleansing, a physical representation of hope. But the hope rarely lasted. For many patients, the weeks following the procedure were filled with quiet disappointment. The soreness faded, the stitches dissolved, and still, the mornings arrived heavy and slow. Still, the mind wandered to dark places. The weight of things, the inexplicable sadness, the tiredness of being alive, remained untouched. Some doctors doubled down. Maybe the gallbladder was next. Maybe it was the appendix. Maybe the uterus. Maybe if they just kept cutting, they would find the sadness and pull it out like a weed. Others began to grow uneasy. A few bold physicians, mostly younger ones returning from Europe, started questioning the methods. They wrote editorials in obscure medical journals. They presented papers titled things like Is All Depression Focal? And a review of surgical failures in melancholic cases. They were ignored. After all, there was no profit in uncertainty. And in a country that prized action, waiting and watching simply wasn't enough. So the cutting continued, even as whispers of doubt grew louder, even as patients left sanitariums thinner, quieter, and somehow more alone than when they arrived. Even as doctors, late at night, began to wonder if perhaps they'd gotten it all wrong. Because deep down, most of them knew the truth. You can remove a tooth. You can take out a tonsil. You can slice away what you can see. But the ache behind the eyes, the heaviness in the chest, that was never in the throat to begin with. By the late 1930s, with thousands of teeth yanked and tonsils stripped away in the name of happiness, the medical imagination wandered further down, right into the gut. If your sadness didn't live in your jaw or your throat, perhaps it had settled in your colon. After all, doctors had begun to notice a curious pattern. Many patients who complained of melancholy also reported vague digestive woes, bloating, constipation, a general sense of sluggishness, as though their very insides had given up. This wasn't coincidence, they said. It was congestion of the soul. Into the era of intestinal cures, enemas, laxatives, bowel purges. By the 1940s, depression and nervous instability were often addressed not with talk or sympathy, but with irrigation tubing and medicated powders. One particularly popular concoction was milk of magnesia, a chalky white liquid that promised to relieve not only constipation but heaviness of thought. Advertisements featured delicate women staring dreamily into the middle distance, a bottle by their side and the promise of lightness returning to their step. Hospitals began offering internal hygiene clinics. Wealthier patients could sign up for a full detoxification regimen, 3 days of liquids, regular enemas, and scheduled abdominal massages to realign the colon. For the truly downcast, doctors sometimes recommended surgical removal of a portion of the large intestine. That'll cheer you up. And, somehow, people agreed. Not because they enjoyed it, but because in a world where emotional language was limited, where therapy was a whispered taboo, a stomachache was easier to admit than sorrow. It was safer to say, "My digestion is off," than to say, "I cannot feel joy." Even the terminology cooperated. Depression was spoken of in words borrowed from the gut. Heavy, sunken, backed up, weighed down. The metaphors felt natural, because they were quite literally practiced on the body. One 1941 pamphlet published by a Minnesota medical group encouraged wives to monitor their husband's regularity if they noticed signs of gloom or irritability. "A man with a troubled stomach is often a man with troubled moods," it read. "And no man can be charming when his bowels are burdened." This was the mindset, that the body was a system of pipes, and sadness was simply the pressure that built up when something got stuck. In the grand sweep of American medicine, this approach wasn't just reductive, it was deeply moralistic. The clean and regular body became a stand-in for the clean and regular mind. If your thoughts were foggy, your colon must be impure. If you couldn't rise in the morning with pep and cheer, perhaps it was because you hadn't had a satisfying movement. Women, especially, bore the brunt of this thinking. Depression in women was often recast as intestinal congestion due to emotional instability. They were prescribed colonics alongside sedatives, and warned not to speak too freely of the blues lest they be labeled hysterical, or worse, spoiled. Magazines for housewives ran soft-focus features with titles like "Is your mood just a matter of movement?" or "Tummy trouble?" or something more. Some doctors even developed mood charts based on bowel habits. One graph from a 1938 medical journal connected frequency of elimination to emotional wellness scores, with cheerful annotations like 3x a week equals moderately stable, 1x a day equals emotionally sound, 2x day or more equals possibly manic. It was pseudoscience, of course, but it offered an illusion of control. If you couldn't fix your marriage, at least you could fix your fiber intake. If the world felt gray and your days felt long, maybe a warm enema would make it all a bit more bearable. This was the subtle tragedy of it all, that in the face of deep, nuanced suffering, doctors and patients alike kept reaching for something mechanical. A tooth, a tonsil, a bowel, a valve that could be twisted, flushed, or removed. Something tangible. It wasn't just ignorance. It was a kind of cultural desperation. Americans, practical to the core, wanted fixes, preferably quick ones, and preferably without needing to admit that feelings existed in the first place. So sadness remained a shadow, barely spoken aloud. It was clothed in symptoms and flushed through tubing, handled quietly in porcelain bowls and whispered about behind clinic doors. It wasn't until the 1950s that this began to shift. Slowly, Therapists and analysts, once viewed with skepticism, began to gain ground. A few brave physicians started to say, perhaps sadness is not always surgical. Books appeared, journals, conferences. Still, for many, the body remained the first suspect. And for others, especially the poor, the rural, the skeptical, that suspicion never really went away. Even now, in some corners of the world, you will find home remedies for sadness that start with a cup of senna tea and end with a trip to the bathroom. And who's to say they're entirely wrong? Sometimes, perhaps, lightness begins in the gut. But the real weight, the ache that sits behind the ribs, that was never a plumbing issue. Somewhere between the abscessed molars and the stubborn bowels, a new idea took hold. An idea that felt, oddly enough, rather cheerful. Maybe what the depressed patient really needed was a better smile. It sounds ridiculous now, but in the 1940s and 50s, the idea that dental aesthetics could treat, or at least ease, depression became surprisingly popular in American medical circles. The thinking went like this: poor dental hygiene led to social shame. Shame led to withdrawal. Withdrawal led to sadness. Sadness deepened into despair. The solution? Remove the shame. And so began the era of the smile cure. Across the country, dentists and physicians began collaborating in unexpected ways. A general practitioner might refer a patient not to a psychiatrist, but to a cosmetic dentist. Just a little improvement in the bite, they'd say. Maybe some reshaping of the gum line. Let's get those front teeth cleaned up. It wasn't about cavities anymore. It was about confidence. Self-esteem, they believed, lived somewhere between the canines and the incisors. You'd walk into a small-town dental office and see posters with slogans like "A bright smile can lift a heavy heart," or "Fix the frown at its roots." In some cases, dentists offered emotional uplift packages, cleanings, extractions, bridges, and whitening, all bundled together under the promise of a more optimistic outlook. Patients weren't always eager, but after being told that their sadness might stem from something as fixable as an overbite, many gave in. After all, what was the harm in trying? In truth, some people did feel better. Temporarily. A cleaner mouth could mean fewer infections, fewer smells, less self-consciousness. It could make one more willing to speak, to smile, to look up during conversations. For those who lived with missing or blackened teeth, a new set of dentures really could feel like being reborn. But the line between helpful dentistry and dangerous delusion blurred fast. Some doctors became obsessed with jaw alignment. They theorized that improper bite tension, called occlusal disharmony, was responsible for everything from migraines to melancholia. You weren't sad, they said. Your molars just weren't meeting properly. Others took it further. One California dentist published a now-lost 1952 paper arguing that improperly spaced teeth could disrupt facial nerve vibrations, which in turn led to spiritual exhaustion. His answer? Aggressive reshaping. He'd file down the enamel, reshape the molars, and restore the inner harmony. Patients described the procedure as painful, surreal, and strangely convincing. There was a lot of blood, one elderly patient recalled in a 1993 oral history interview. But I thought, if this puts the joy back in my heart, I'll take it. In mid-century ads, smiling was therapeutic. Literally, you were encouraged to practice it in the mirror, even if you didn't feel it. Especially if you didn't feel it. The smile was both the symptom and the cure. One 1947 pamphlet titled "The Dental Key to Happiness" recommended this daily regimen. Floss morning and night. Smile in the mirror for 1 full minute, 3 times a day. Visit your dentist every 6 weeks. Avoid sulking, as it damages oral posture. And yet beneath this glossy optimism was something darker. Many of the patients being steered toward dental treatment were women, particularly housewives. The logic was subtle. She's not mentally ill. She's just let herself go. Get her teeth fixed. Put a little red lipstick on, and maybe the blues will vanish. This belief wasn't limited to backrooms or quacks. Some mainstream physicians genuinely argued that cosmetic dental work could reduce the need for hysteria medications. Their advice to husbands was simple: before you send her to a shrink, send her to a hygienist. The woman, once again, was reduced to a mouth. Pain was prettified. Inner turmoil was flattened into an aesthetic problem. How inner life? Irrelevant. Just get those teeth straightened, dear. For poorer patients, the situation could be even more absurd. County hospitals sometimes offered dental corrections as part of their psychiatric programs, not out of belief in the therapy, but because it gave patients something to do. Pulling a tooth was easier, faster, and cheaper than months of actual counseling. To the administrators, it was cost-effective optimism. To the patients, it was a strange kind of theater. Even those who didn't believe in the smile cure often went along with it. What else was there? Few had access to real therapy. Few still felt safe speaking openly about their minds. But everyone understood teeth. They were visible, concrete, tactile. You could fix them. You could point to them. And when they were gone, at least there was something to show for your pain. And maybe that was the unspoken comfort of it all. In a culture terrified of invisible suffering, pulling a tooth was proof. Proof that the pain was real. Proof that something had been done. Even if the sadness remained, gaping and silent. By the early 1950s, something strange had settled across small-town America. It wasn't just that people were visiting their dentists more often. It was that they were visiting them emotionally. You'd see it in waiting rooms. A woman in her late 40s, staring at the floor, clutching her purse like it might float her out of her own life. A teenage boy, barely speaking, brought in by a worried mother who didn't know how to say the word sad. An old man whose wife had died the year before, whose only complaint, he told the nurse, was a general ache behind the teeth. Behind the teeth. As if sorrow had a location. As if despise sat somewhere in the gum line. Dentists were in a peculiar position. They weren't trained in mental health, but they were trusted. They were often local. Their chairs were familiar. They didn't carry the same stigma as shrinks. So when people couldn't afford a psychiatrist, or didn't believe in one, they made do. And if all you had was a dental drill, every problem looked like plaque. Some dentists leaned into this role. They began offering oral equilibrium sessions, gentle cleanings paired with quiet conversation. They said things like, "Sometimes the pain in your jaw is grief biting down too hard." Others prescribed night guards not just for grinding, but for nightmares. Then there were the dentists who saw themselves as full-blown healers. One Michigan dentist, writing in a Now Lost 1955 editorial, claimed that when molars are removed with care, the patient's darker thoughts often leave with them. He dubbed this the eviction theory of depression. The phrase caught on, especially among lay people. To evict the darkness, to extract the gloom. It had a ring to it. Soon, desperate patients began making requests. Take out the ones that hurt the most. Get rid of the crooked ones. I've always hated them. Pull the last ones she touched. Dentists complied, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes not. One 1956 article in the American Dental Review described a case where a widow asked to have her wedding teeth removed, the ones capped just before the ceremony 22 years earlier. She said she could no longer bear to chew with them. The dentist, according to the article, understood the symbolism and proceeded with compassion. That same article reported on a quiet trend. Patients requesting full mouth extractions, despite having no infections, no decay, no obvious need. They weren't asking for dentures. They just wanted emptiness. It's easier, one man wrote in a letter to his dentist, to feel nothing in the mouth than to feel too much in the heart. This silent epidemic eventually reached the desks of mental health professionals. Some were horrified, others intrigued. A few began studying the phenomenon, referring to it clinically as oral somatic substitution, the displacement of psychic pain into the mouth. It wasn't entirely new. Freud himself had spoken of oral fixations, of teeth dreams, of the link between repression and the jaw. But this was something more physical, more procedural. It was Freud with pliers. Yet for every analyst decrying the dental trend, there was another who quietly recommended it, especially in institutions. State-run asylums, short on staff and therapies, sometimes turned to dental procedures as a kind of symbolic reset. Patients who wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat, wouldn't engage, were scheduled for dental work. Not always medically necessary, just something to do. Dental intervention produces observable behavior shifts. One 1958 report noted. The patient post-extraction often exhibits temporary compliance, reduced resistance, and increased docility. Docility. That was the word that kept turning up. Not happiness, not relief, but quietness. A kind of domesticated sadness. The ideal post-patient wasn't cured, just manageable, less troublesome, easier to ignore. Back at home, in the world of house calls and local clinics, the line between dentist and therapist continued to blur. One upstate New York dentist added an extra chair to his office, not a dental one, just a regular chair. He called it the talking chair. Patients would sit there after procedures and unload, as he put it, before heading back out into the cold. He didn't give advice. He didn't diagnose. He just listened. Then he billed them for the filling. By 1960, the cultural fascination with the mouth as a gateway to the mind began to fade. Psychiatry grew more sophisticated. Antidepressants emerged. The dental as therapy craze was quietly retired. But it left traces. You can still find them in old ads, faded and foxed, promising a better bite, a brighter outlook. You can find them in the interviews with elderly patients who still remember the pain and the strange hope that came with losing a tooth on purpose. And sometimes, in quiet homes, you can find them in the nightstands. Little boxes holding teeth not because they were diseased, but because they were sad, pulled not to end the pain, but to mark its passage. A ritual, a silent plea, a way to say, this hurt, and now it's gone. By the late 1960s, America had entered a new era of mental health. Psychiatry was no longer something spoken of in hushed tones. Pills had names now. Valium, Librium, Elavil. There were hotline numbers, support groups, clinical trials, talk shows. But in the quieter corners of the country, in farm towns and faded mill cities, the old ways still lingered. You'd still hear stories of the tooth doctor who could ease your grief. A widower in Nebraska who claimed he never cried until the dentist pulled his incisors. A Kansas mother who swore her daughter got better after a molar extraction. The belief didn't vanish. It softened, like everything else in those towns, into something between folklore and coping strategy. And in some ways, that's what it had always been. Because what were these procedures, really, but a form of ritualized suffering? A socially acceptable outlet for internal chaos. You couldn't cry at the store, couldn't collapse at work, but you could make an appointment. You could sit in that chair. You could say this one aches, even if it didn't. And someone, calm, sterile, professional, would give you permission to hurt, to wince, to bleed, to be sore for a few days, and then, slowly, to recover. The mouth became a metaphor for resilience. Teeth were seen not just as tools, but as emblems, white, visible reminders of strength or its absence. So when someone had theirs pulled, not for rot or decay, but for feeling too much, it meant something. And it still does. Even now, with all our science and language, there are people who choose discomfort just to make their sadness visible. Not always in the dental chair, of course, but in other quiet, sanctioned ways. The long run, the cold plunge, the tiny tattoo, the haircut after heartbreak, the piercing at 2 a.m., the weird juice cleanse, the voluntary silence. Modern molars, all of them. Because somewhere, deep down, the instinct remains to fix the inside, do something to the outside, to change the body, to feel the shift, to mark the sorrow. And if a dentist once offered that, even crudely, even accidentally, then maybe we owe them a nod. Not for their technique, but for their strange, reluctant empathy. Because they didn't mean to be healers of the mind. They just held the tools, and the chair, and the time. And sometimes, that's all healing needs. So if you ever find yourself in a dusty antique shop, and you stumble across a little box, velvet-lined, faded gold trim, and inside you find 4 or 5 human teeth, don't be alarmed. They weren't always forgotten. They might have been cherished, painfully earned, left behind not for their value, but for the memory of their removal. A quiet therapy, a brutal grace, one last extraction before the silence.